A Tale of Two Cities, Police, Crime, and the Homeless. Hello everyone, and welcome to Solving Problems with Bobtheorc. If you like what I'm doing, come subscribe to me on YouTube for all our normal stuff. You can check out the spicy stuff on Rumble, and check out the website, bobtheorc.com, where you can see all the stuff that I'm writing and talking about. So let's get right into it. So, I was listening today to a debate, or really kind of a conversation among various city council members and candidates running for city council here in Norman, Oklahoma, where I've been kind of hiding out for the past couple of years. And one of the themes that kept coming up over and over again was the homeless problem in Norman. And Norman, like many cities in America, have some homeless people. And it's been getting worse, and there's a number of reasons why. And they were also debating crime and the police and a number of topics, right? And you had people on the left and people on the right, you know, honest liberals and honest conservatives discussing their ideas for how to solve the problem. And I think that everybody involved was well-meaning. I didn't get the sense that anybody was just like an establishment shill or anything. But there's a certain nuance to solving these kinds of problems I think people were missing. And you know, there's a lot of common talking points. Oh, fully fund the police, you know, is what a lot of conservatives will say. And liberals will be like, oh, we need to build more affordable housing and build homeless shelters. And I mean, there's valid reasons for both those opinions. But it kind of misses the point. I wanted to get into that a little bit. And I've got some background. You know, I grew up in New York City, which had a big homeless problem when they kind of closed out a lot of the nut houses, and you ended up with a lot of mentally ill patients on the street. And there's a lot of crime and a lot of drugs, and New York's had its ups and downs. And then I've been here in Oklahoma for a while as well. I'm kind of a man of both worlds. And one of the big problems that you get into is that there's not really a one-size-fits-all solution. And a common problem that you see both on the left and the right is you'll have these talking points that sound good, and they make for a good soundbite when you're running for office. But if you kind of dive into the details, it leaves, you know, it leaves something to be desired. I want to kind of get into that kind of in good faith and discuss my ideas. That way, you know, whoever wins the various city council positions, or if you're in a different city and you wanna try and solve some of these problems, maybe I can give you some insight into some possible solutions. So I've got a little bit of experience with this. I've got a friend. He's a disabled vet who's been dealing with a lot of problems. And it's not that he's a bad person. I mean, he's kind of an ass sometimes, but he's got bad PTSD. You know, a lot of people, when you're in a war zone, sometimes you see some stuff that nobody should really ever see, right? And it's rough. And he got back, and he was you know, from Iraq, and he was dealing with the VA. But during COVID, the VA services just weren't keeping up, and over the course of a few years, he just started going kind of downhill, and bad decisions, hanging out with the wrong crowd. All you kids out there, your mom was right when she says don't hang out with the wrong people, because it's going to screw you later in life. And so he ended up in and out of jail, and just hanging out with the wrong people, you eventually get caught up in all the trouble that they're involved in. And what struck me as interesting is, you know, his lawyer got him a deal where he's into some sort of a community sentencing program instead of doing hard prison time, because he's screwed up a number of times. And it's supposed to be a program that helps him get on his feet, you know, mental health and housing and drug rehab and all that stuff, right? And instead, he's basically having to work his ass off at a minimum wage job, trying to pay, you know, money every month for all of these meetings that don't take into account his work schedule and don't take into account his situation. He's not getting any mental help. He's not given, you know, he's not getting any assistance with the place to live. The VA has totally dropped the ball. And I think he's going to probably end up in jail if, again, and it's just a revolving door. You know, it's just kind of like he's being extracted for money, and nobody really gives a damn about him. And that seems to be a common problem. So all you conservatives out there, when liberals are talking about how you need to help people, there is a valid point to that, right? You know, a lot of these troubled individuals do need help. Now, on the other hand, conservatives are kind of correct in that you can't just give people stuff and have them get on their feet. A lot of the solutions that are being promised don't necessarily work. And you really have to, if you dig into it deeply, you have to really look at a lot of things on a case-by-case basis. And as and I like a very scientific method of problem solving, in that if you can examine the underlying cause of a problem, you can eventually facilitate a solution, right? But if you don't ever address the underlying causes, then you're just basically putting a band-aid on things, and that doesn't help. And when you look at it, crime and homelessness are really two sides of the same coin. I'm going to show you why. So first, let's get into the fully fund the police argument that you'll hear many conservatives say. So I'm going to compare New York City with Norman, Oklahoma. New York City is the best funded police force in the world. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't think there's anybody else that spends more money on police as New York. They've got about 30,000 police officers, 36,000 I think, according to Google. And New York City has a population of about 8 million people, which is about double the size of all of the state of Oklahoma. New York City takes about 300 square miles, and that's roughly one police officer for every 225 people, or about 120 police officers per square mile, 119 if you want to be precise. That's a lot of police officers. Norman, Oklahoma is very different. Norman's a small city. There's about 200 police officers, 190, 200, something like that. And Norman has, last I checked, about 125,000 people living in it. And Norman's a pretty big place. It's about 189 square miles, according to Google. So that's roughly one police officer for every 625 people, or roughly one police officer per square mile. Norman is almost as big as New York City. I think New York City has about 50% more land area, with just a vastly huge population. So you get a lot of population density. And so what happens in New York, if there's a problem, you've got a police officer on every corner. I mean, basically speaking, you'll have more in Times Square area and more around some of the more crowded places, and you'll have less in some of the poor parts of town. You don't see a police officer on every corner in Harlem, but you'll see quite a bit more where there's money. And police tend to congregate where there's money. That's just a reality of life. But there's a lot of police, and if you have trouble, when I was a kid, if I had trouble in New York, I could very quickly find a police officer to help me. Oklahoma's not like that. There's a huge amount of land for a very small population. My apartment building that I grew up in New York had about 2,500 people in that building. Just one building, right? I think my entire neighborhood in Oklahoma doesn't even have 2,500 people. And so I think I calculated out that would be about 12 police officers allocated to that one building, just for the population in that building in New York City. And they wouldn't all be on duty at any given time. So maybe you have like 4 police officers running in per shift, 3 police officers per shift. But on average, you're going to have a constant police presence. Oklahoma couldn't do that. Even if we fully funded the police, you're never going to have enough police officers. Norman can't afford that. So that's just never going to happen. Now let's look at the other side of the equation. Regarding homeless, building affordable housing won't work either. In my experience, homeless people tend to fit in about 3 categories. Your first category is people who just had something bad happen in life. We've all been there. We've all had problems. And, I mean, I've even been homeless for a time or two. In college, my first year in college, I didn't realize they closed the dorms during the summertime. I didn't make any preparations. I had no idea. And all of a sudden, poof, you've got to be out tomorrow. And I'll be, well, I don't know where I'm going to go. And so, I ended up couch surfing, and I ended up, bouncing around. I stayed with my grandmother in Tulsa for a while and had to commute every day, and that sucked. But I got through it, and, with the help of friends, right? It was a temporary problem because, I was resourceful. I had I had my life together. Everything was okay. Most people in this first category they just have bad luck. They're determined, they're resourceful, they're hardworking, and they're going to solve their problem. And they just need a little bit of help to get through it. And a lot of times they won't even turn to the state. They'll turn to private charities or just their friends and family, and they're going to get through it. These people are not generally the problem. And they're not going to be homeless for very long. And if you give them some assistance, it's going to generally be very successful. So when liberals talk about affordable housing and helping people and various programs, this first category of people, this is who they're really targeting. This is who everybody thinks about. When you think about homeless, you're thinking about that family that just had something bad happen, and they're easy to fix. The problem is they're a small percentage of the homeless population. Now, the second category are people who are going to suffer from mental illness. They have drug addictions, and this is the majority in my experience. Growing up in New York, nearly every homeless person on the street was either completely nuts or a total addict. There's this one guy growing up he was an out-of-work musician. He had some bad luck, and there was some construction. In New York, you get this construction where they'll cover the street to protect from falling debris from buildings, because the buildings are really tall and stuff falls sometimes. And a lot of homeless people will live under these construction areas where it's into these protected sidewalks because it keeps the rain off. And so this guy, he was an out-of-work musician, a couple blocks away from Lincoln Center, sitting there living with his piano on the street. And he lived there for a few weeks. Eventually, I guess he found some place to go. And he just had a run of bad luck. And I talked to him. He'd sit there and he'd play the piano for tips, and then at nighttime he'd sleep under the piano. And that's a very New York thing. I've never seen that anywhere else. That's the exception. Every other homeless person I saw in New York was either completely nuts or they were cracked out on drugs. And here in Oklahoma, when I see people homeless, usually they're on drugs. And I hate to break it to you, but that's just the reality of it. And, because all of my friends, when they have trouble, if they end up homeless, they got kicked out by, in a divorce, or they lost their job and couldn't pay their rent, they go stay with a friend, they bounce on somebody's couch, and, and it's no big deal. But most people who are having these problems, they're on drugs. And that's just the sad truth of it all. I can't count the number of naked crackheads I've seen in Norman, probably 5 or 6 just running down the street over the years. It happens. The final category are the transient populations. And these people, there's a lot of people who live a nomadic life. They want to, hippies in the woods, or they're just traveling around, passing through. Some of them just don't want to be part of society. Others are on the run. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for these guys, I don't think. I know this one girl who just up and decided, I'm going to buy a van and I'm going to live in my van and travel the country, and because I want to see the whole country. And to my knowledge, she spent a year or two driving around the country living in her van. Is she homeless? Well, yeah, kind of. I mean, she's living in her van, but I think she's very different than somebody who's living in the park, high on drugs and completely screwed in life. So you got to really take care of this on a case-by-case basis. And I know politicians hate that, because nobody's ever going to vote for you if you say, well, I'm going to use my good judgment and I'm going to take care of things on a case-by-case basis. Nobody's going to believe you. Politicians lie too much. And so politicians want a plan saying, I'm going to do this. We're going to build that. We have these solutions. The reality is, a portion of the population, you're just not going to help. And I think that the transients, you're not really going to be able to help them that much. And if you do help them, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. So let's talk about solutions for small cities, okay? So A lot of people like to turn to the big cities like New York and Chicago and LA and all these big places, and they want to try and copy their policies, and that doesn't work. I mean, there's a couple reasons why it doesn't work. The first reason is Norman, Oklahoma is vastly different from New York City. Norman will never be New York City, and frankly, you don't want to be New York City either, because New York City has its own set of problems. You know, the other problem is that the people who run New York City are largely incompetent, and it's such a corrupt system there that that's a bad system to follow. But Norman has some advantages and disadvantages. The big disadvantage is Norman doesn't have a large budget. You're never going to have a big budget. There's not enough tax base, and you know, you'll never be able to grow big enough to have a large tax base like New York City. Even if Norman became as large as Oklahoma City, you'd still not even come close to the sheer volume of money that pours through New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago. It's never going to be that way, right? And you don't have to. There's no way to ever fully fund the police to the extent that one of these big cities will have. Now, on the other hand, because Norman's a smaller city, we don't have all the violent crime that a big city has. You know, we've got some theft, we've got some minor problems, but it's an easier solution in many ways. Whenever you have a dense population, you simply have more human interactions per volume of time. And the more interactions there are, the more chance there is that somebody's going to get into a fight, there's going to be problems. So the fact that Norman is less populated and more spread out, that's an advantage into itself. You know, another advantage that Norman has is that the police in Norman live, by and large, in Norman. A big problem that New York has is you've got a police officer living on Long Island because Manhattan's too expensive for them to live on their salary. They commute to Manhattan, they're policing an area that they don't live in, they don't know the people there, and that, you know, they tend to be more harsh that way, because when somebody's just a face in the crowd and you don't know them, you're going to be a lot more arbitrary. Whereas in Norman, in a smaller city, it's possible to build a better community relation between the population and the police, and it's less likely that they're going to, you know, cross the line, so to speak. I know it happens, and that's a different problem. We'll address that separately. Now, a problem Norman has that because everything's so spread out, it takes longer for the police to get there if there's a problem. I can't think of a single time in Norman that I had a problem where the police got there in time to stop the problem. By the time the police got there, I'd already solved it, and the police were just there taking the report, cleaning the mess. You know, we had, people try to, rob my business, a couple times, for example, when we were first getting started. And by the time the police arrived, we already had the criminal, taken care of on the ground and, ready for the police to cart them off. So it was not a, because it took them, and they got there pretty quick. They got there in like 5 minutes, and that's still pretty fast. But when there's a problem, it's going to be quick. Or if I'm at my house and I have some, drunk or high guy, somebody, cracked out on drugs, running around on meth or whatever, it's going to take the police a while to get here. We had this guy once come to my door. He was buck-ass naked with a knife, higher than shit. And he comes up like, "Hey, man, can I borrow a beer?" And he's pointing his knife at him. It's like, no, you can't borrow a beer. How do you borrow beer? Are you going to give it back when you're done? I don't want it back. I don't drink beer. And so, we had a Second Amendment conversation, and he left. And he went to the next door neighbor, and then he asked my neighbor, "Hey, man, can I borrow your beer?" He's still buck-ass naked with a knife. And the guy pulled out a baseball bat, and he had a conversation with the guy, and the guy left. And he went down the street to the next house and trying to borrow beer, and they pulled a gun, and the next guy, he went down the street, and by the time he was, probably half a mile away by the time the police finally got here and arrested him, while he was, naked trying to borrow a beer from some old lady in the Homeland parking lot. It just takes a while for the police to get here because there's only, on average, about one police officer per square mile. They're going to be 10-15 minutes away. Now, on the other hand, you know, half the population in Norman probably has legal firearms. You know, I would imagine that probably half the people here have guns and are responsible with them, and you know, and that's going to greatly reduce you know, violent crime, because people, you don't have a lot of home invasions in Norman, Oklahoma, because it's a high risk for that's a high risk operation. So there's pros and cons, and what it really comes down to is Norman's going to have to go for more of a community approach towards policing and a community approach towards the homeless population. A top-down big government solution is not going to work, and realistically, a fully privatized solution won't work either. So the big thing, there's really two things that underlie the problem. If you look at the source of the problem, you've got drugs and you've got a lack of opportunity. That's probably, drugs are probably 80% of the problem. I would wager, and I'm sure somebody can look up statistics and find out exactly what it is, but I bet at least 80% of the homeless people in Oklahoma, or in Norman, Oklahoma, are drug addicts or insane. And there's a big overlap. There's a big overlap between people addicted to drugs and people with mental illness problems. A lot of times, drug addicts are just self-medicating. So if you solve the drugs, and then you give these people some sort of opportunity to move forward with their life, whether it's education, you know, maybe work programs, private individuals doing internships, or there's going to have to be some sort of public-private partnership, I would imagine. But you solve drugs, you give these people some opportunity, that's going to take care of probably 80% of the homeless population. You know, you're going to have some people who are just violent criminals, and they're just going to end up in jail. And that's unfortunate, but that's just how life is. For the people who are not violent, who are just simply screwed, like my friend, he's just screwed in life. You know, he's a little bit messed up in the head, and he's not getting the help he needs. If you were to give him the help he needs, that would he would eventually get on his feet. But that help is going to look something like, you can't just have a homeless shelter and expect him to deal with it. Most of these homeless people don't want to be in a shelter. They want to be out on the street doing drugs because they're addicted. When you're addicted to drugs, the only thing you think about is getting high. So eventually they end up in the court system, and instead of tossing them in jail for a while, making them pay fines and kicking them out on the street, that's just going to be an endless cycle. You know, why do you think the liberals hate the private prison system, and why do you think conservatives hate government programs? Because it doesn't work. None of it really works. So if you want to build a homeless center, you know, when these people eventually end up in jail, I know there's like an ethical problem of forcing people into rehab and forcing people into mental institutions, but when somebody ends up in jail and they're convicted of whatever it is that they did, the judge has some certain leeway in assigning, you know, what's going to happen, I would imagine. And so that's the opportunity, I think, to okay, you're guilty, you're going to be put in a program, you're going to be put into a supervised living situation, into a homeless center, you know, rehab, mental health kind of thing, where, you know, in jail they're not going to really get the help they need. I mean, they'll probably clean up because it's harder to get drugs in jail, supposedly, although you hear stories. But, you know, you can put them in some sort of a situation where they've got a place to stay. Don't give them a house. They're going to just screw it up. You know, put them in some sort of an institution, where, like a rehab institution, where they get cleaned up, they have some sort of mental health they need, get on the meds that they need if that's what's necessary, get some sort of job training or vocational training to help them out and help them get their life together, and then put them in a halfway house where they can slowly integrate back into society. And maybe you can help, you know, half the people. I'm sure there's a percentage of the people who are just going to keep going right back to, you know, to drugs and right back to crime. You know, maybe you can find people. You know, I was talking to this guy earlier today who's running for city council, and he was talking about getting people reunited back with their families, and that's a good idea. Except, you know, in my experience, I think a lot of these people don't have the family options. You know, like this one guy who I'm friends with, his family's basically disowned him. He's got nowhere to go. So reuniting him with his family won't do any good. But sure, in the cases where you've got family, where you've got friends, people who will help, help the person out, yeah, by all means. You know, we need to, on a case-by-case basis, find whatever help situation we can. And because you can't force people to do things against their will, it's probably going to have to happen as some sort of a deal with the court system, because eventually they're going to get in trouble, and then once they're in trouble, that's when you have the opportunity to step in and provide them with involuntary help if they don't want to do it voluntarily to begin with. But that's kind of the shape of what's gonna happen, because like a lot of the car break-ins that you see here in Norman, that's just people trying to bust a window, grab a wallet, grab a purse, so they can go get drugs to get high the next day. You know, and more police isn't going to solve that problem. You know, growing up in New York, I saw people steal a car in like 30 seconds. You know, certainly in under a minute. So even if the police officer's 5 minutes away, they're not going to get there in time. Car's going to be gone. So you've got to address the underlying problem. And then once we address the underlying problem, then we turn this into a solvable situation where we can start iterating through the people we can help and help as many as we can. And then the ones that we can't, we'll just have to deal with them as we go. But if we can address the drugs and give these people some opportunity, I think that's going to take a big burden off the system. And Norman's in a unique position to do that because we have a strong community. You know, in New York City, there's just too many people and nobody knows each other, and that wouldn't work as well. You'd end up having to lock people away. It'd have to be a more of a public situation. But they've got the budget to deal with it. In Norman, you don't have the budget, so you've got to work something out. Anyway, that's my thoughts. I hope you guys find this useful, and you know, feel free to comment in the YouTube channel. I'm going to go post this video up on YouTube because I think this is pretty tame. I don't think YouTube's going to ban me for talking about homeless people. And if anybody wants to come on and talk to me about it, just hit me up. You can reach me at my computer store, Norman Computers. You can contact me through the website. Go send me a message on Facebook. I'm easy to get in touch with. And let's sit down and talk about it. Let's go solve the problem. So thank you everyone for watching, and good night.